Hi there. Today we're going to be talking about Agile Leadership Patterns. So the work that we're about to talk about is based on a set of 5 patterns called the Agile Base Patterns, and it turns out they provide some guidance for what good leaders look like in Agile organizations. My name is Dan Greening. I am managing director of a consulting firm called Cenex Rex. We do Agile coaching and training worldwide. We tend to be quantitative folks, so we're very interested in metrics, and you'll see some of that emphasis in today's talk. I'm a certified Scrum coach with the Scrum Alliance. That means actually that I'm trained and experienced in working with large enterprises to do agile transitions and sustainability. And so 2 big companies that I've worked with are Skype and Citrix Online. So Skype was about 1,500 people, Citrix Online about 1,000 people. At Skype, there were 8 coaches worldwide. At Citrix Online, there were about 7 coaches, and they were also worldwide. And so I've been all over the world talking about this stuff. One of the issues related to worldwide coaching is that it is really important that people talk to each other and understand cultures and how those cultures interact with each other. And I found that only through travel and working directly with people on the ground in different countries was I able to help people communicate better. My background actually is unusual, perhaps. I'm both a researcher. I have a PhD in computer science, particularly related to complex systems and complexity theory. And then I also have started a few startups. A couple of them were very successful, and one of them was not so successful. So I started studying Agile right away after that problem startup. And then the second thing I started studying was Lean Startup, which is a method for doing product management. So both of those experiences really help inform and motivate me. So today's agenda is first we're going to talk a little bit about Lean and Agile methodologies and why they arose. And there's some specific example companies that are worth looking at. We're going to talk about patterns in Lean and Agile methodologies. It turns out that there's a bunch of different methodologies, from Lean Startup to Scrum to Kanban, Lean Manufacturing, even things like Pomodoro and getting things done are essentially Agile methodologies, and they all try to accomplish something important, and we'll see what that is. We're going to talk a little bit about organizations and how it's very difficult to sustain agility in these organizations. So we'll talk about what causes that and what we might be able to do about that. And then finally, I'll talk about something near and dear to my heart, which is characteristics of Agile managers. What do we look for in managers that really make them succeed and sustain agility in an organization? So the first thing I want to talk about is one of the earliest Agile implementations, which was in Toyota. So Toyota was a car manufacturer. It was founded in the 30s, went through World War II, and nearly went bankrupt in the 50s. In the 60s, they started doing something a little bit unusual. They did something called just-in-time, and you see that here, JIT. Nowadays, we call it lean manufacturing. The general idea is this. Someone orders a vehicle at Toyota back in the 60s, and Toyota said, well, we don't keep any inventory on the site. What we'll do is you order a car or a truck or whatever, and we will actually manufacture the body. We'll put the chassis together, we'll put the wheels and the tires together, and we'll build the car to order every time. So that is different from another company called General Motors. So they did something where they would try to forecast what was going to happen in the market. Would people want small cars or big cars? Would they want trucks, or would they want, semi trucks? And so they would forecast that, and then they would hope that the forecast was right, and they would create an inventory of specific types of cars, and then they would ship them to dealers worldwide, and then hope that demand would come and pick them up. Toyota did another thing, which was to instill a culture within the organization of continuous improvement, where it was everyone's responsibility to identify problems as they came during the construction of a car, and then alert people when there were problems and actually improve the processes. So while GM had a lot of contracts with union people, and there were a lot of dictated actions from that. Toyota had top-down value alignment. They did something called Hoshin Kanri, where executives get together and decide what the major goals of Toyota are, and they would flow those goals down through the organization. GM had a different structure where plant managers had a lot of autonomy, could decide for themselves how to run their plants and that sort of thing. Toyota promoted this idea of collective responsibility, where every person on the line felt personally responsible for a great vehicle coming off the line. GM had role-based responsibility, where it depended on what your title was, what you were really responsible for. And finally, Toyota had this idea of respect for people. What they meant by that is that people are smart and can do different things, and so they want to allow people to do all the thinking stuff while they would automate everything else, and that what they call that automation. GM had rather a class-based association where people had different classes. In fact, they have a headquarters in Detroit that's really beautiful, but that's where they put their executives. Turns out there's a big difference between what happened to these two companies. Toyota became the most profitable manufacturer in the world, and GM went bankrupt in 2007. A similar thing started happening in the software industry starting in the 80s. We started discovering a lot of failures that cost a lot of money. I suppose this is a little bit invisible, but what I'd like to point out is that in every year from about 1992 until about 2005, we're looking at somewhere around $500 million worth of software failures were occurring at least. So these are the ones we know about, but there's a lot of them that were kept hidden during this time. It was written up by a guy named Charette in an article called Why Software Fails in IEEE Spectrum. And so this, I'll give you an example of what happened here. We had waterfall, which is a long-term planning process for software where we make decisions up front about what's going to be in the project 18 months from now. And then we just follow through in a set of phases where we do different things until we actually deliver the final result. That's a kind of natural way to think of things. It turns out, though, that waterfall has a fairly big failure rate. About 29% of waterfall projects in 2011, very recently, were failures. What I mean by that is they spent their money and they didn't actually produce something of value, and the project was abandoned. So only about 14%, this green section here, were clear successes, that they were within budget and produced the results that people wanted. 57% were in this questionable category, challenged, meaning that they may have been produced, but they didn't produce all the features that were really needed, or they were produced much over budget and over time. So we have a different strategy called Agile that we'll talk about here, and Agile projects have about 3 times the success rate and 1/3 the failure rate of waterfall projects. So this is a pretty good result. And the reason that we it was these failures that really caused us to think very carefully, what were we doing? And we would be willing to pay a big price to get that failure rate down and to get our success rate up. Well, Agile is the big price we paid. So let me define agility for us. So Agile organizations, I think, can sense what's happening in the marketplace or with their production systems. They can adapt to what's happening in the marketplace or with their production systems or with whatever context they're working in. And they can create rapidly. So all of these things they can sense, adapt, create faster than the chaos that they operate in. And it turns out this chaos is really important to understand for agility. So chaos creates opportunities. And let's talk a little bit about what chaos is. It means that a chaotic system is a system where you can actually predict what's going to happen in the short term, but the longer the duration of the forecast, it actually increases exponentially the error we have. So the idea with chaos is the more chaotic an economy is, the faster the forecast will diverge from what actually happens in that marketplace or that economy. And so that's the idea. If we have a chaotic economy, we need to sense, adapt, and create rapidly enough to sort of surf that chaos and win. And the faster that we do that, the more likely we are to beat competitors that are not doing that. So what kind of patterns do we see in Agile practices? I want to talk briefly about what patterns look like. So patterns are a technique for describing a problem and a solution. What we do first is we describe the problem. So this problem is fixed plans often lead to failure. So fixed plans are all based on economics. So economics means that we have a limited set of resources and we're trying to produce value with that. So another thing that's kind of relevant here is that creativity is fueled by mastery, autonomy, and purpose. So this is Daniel Pink's idea that we are motivated by these ideas: mastery of the craft that we're working on, autonomy meaning that we can make decisions for ourselves, and purpose meaning that we're trying to serve a higher purpose. Those things fuel creativity. It isn't about how much money you make. So if someone is creative and you try to pay them more money to be more creative, it turns out it has the opposite effect, a perverse effect. It drives their creativity down. They get more desperate, and so that desperation reduces their creativity. So a pattern says, what's the problem? And then it talks about forces that constrain a solution. So one of the forces here is that success metrics that we often think about lag the work. So our stock price lags the work. Risk is often unmeasured in these fixed plans, and creativity actually creates variation. So this is something that a lot of people try to control when they're doing something called lean manufacturing, but it turns out that that will limit creativity if you apply it to people. So we want to recognize that creativity and variation go hand in hand. So therefore, since we have these forces and this problem, we need to solve it, and one way to solve it is to measure economic progress. So in other words, to look at leading indicators for how we're doing and actually try to adapt to those leading indicators. So that means a bunch of things, but one is your organization ought to know what its top-level goals are, and it ought to have some leading indicators to see whether it's achieving those goals. And if you want alignment within the company, you have these top-level goals bubble down through the organization so that everyone from customer service to development to QA to legal and all those other things are lined up with those top-level goals. You can always test these ideas with forecasts, And the point is you need to embrace objectivity in order to make a great result. So you can read about this pattern on our website, cenexrex.com, and you can just look for measure economic progress. That is something that's shared with all Agile practices. So economic metrics have many facets, and it turns out we like to apply some principles to make sure that we don't have perversity. So perversity means that you have a metric that's really driving your organization to do something that you think is important, but actually it's having an effect that's causing damage in another area. So if you have multiple metrics working together, you can actually, that are pushing against each other, and let's talk about Agile teams, for example, that are producing software. Quality is important, so we need to measure the bug count, for example. Velocity is important. How much functionality are we able to shove through the system? And the happiness of the team is important because we want the team to be stable. So those three things have a tendency to push against each other and create a nice outcome. But we can't translate that into one metric. We can't say, is A times X plus B times Y plus C times Z to create a single metric that will indicate how great the team is. In fact, we keep those metrics separate so that we can look at them and assess them over time. So the result is that of measuring economic progress is that we start having a more coherent company with mission, vision, and goals that are lined up with its needs, and we go all the way down through many teams and employees where they're all serving the same set of goals in their particular department, their particular role. We're also keeping constant awareness of what's going on, especially since these are leading indicators, and we can learn more because we can watch what's happening in the economy that we're working in and when we make different changes. So that's nice. It helps us forecast better. That's really great. So the question is, are we really agile if we measure economic progress? Well, not really, because we can sense fast enough to adapt to the economy, and we can maybe create with the economy, but this is only about sensing, really. So we need to start thinking about adaptation and creation as something that we need to do. And it turns out the second pattern helps us do that. So what is that? Well, the problem is that reacting is not enough. So for measuring stuff in our company and something happens in the economy, we can start to correlate what's happening in the economy with the effects on the organization. But in fact, that's probably not going to be fast enough. You know, Kodak famously lost its marketplace when it didn't realize that film was going away. And it wasn't really testing the marketplace sufficiently up front, and ultimately they went bankrupt. Complacency, right? So they were just hoping everything would be okay, and the economy was telling them everything was going to be okay, and then suddenly the economy dropped completely and it was gone. So instead of doing that, we can adaptively experiment. In Scrum, this is called retrospection. There we look at metrics from a previous Scrum sprint, and we compare them to our hypothesized result. So that hypothesis tells us what we thought we would do based on process changes in that past sprint. And then then the outcome might not be what we expect. So then we have to look at, okay, what is the thing that may have caused that unexpected result? Now we're starting to create theories, and we can test some of those theories in the coming sprint. We can say, you know, we think dependencies got in our way. And so we think that if we limit dependencies in a definition of ready, for example, that our velocity will go way up. That is a hypothesis. It's constructing an experiment in your retrospection. With that experiment, now we can test whether our theory is correct by limiting dependencies and running a sprint. There's a lot of cautionary notes on adaptively experiment. I invite you to look at the definition of this pattern online. It's pretty detailed. So I did talk about Scrum retrospection, assemble metrics, validate the last hypothesis, brainstorm improvements, hypothesize effects in the coming sprint, and then commit to controlling the experiment in the next sprint. So one of the things I started asking myself after defining this pattern, what is the role of a Scrum Master in this environment? And when I'm talking to a live audience, I'll often ask people what they think the Scrum Master's role is, and they often bring up various things. But here is what I think the Scrum Master's role is in this experimental setting. During the retrospective, they facilitate the construction of a new experiment. So they are the person that helps assemble the metrics, or they may do the metric assembly themselves and present the metrics from the last sprint. The team looks at those metrics and compares them to the hypothesis and tries to figure out whether the hypothesis was validated by the experiment. Whether it was or it wasn't, we now want to look at whether we have new conclusions that we can draw from that experiment. Then we say, well, we would like to improve some more. And the Scrum Master helps brainstorm those improvements and gets the team to hypothesize effects and gets the team to come to a commitment on the next experiment. What will we all agree to do? That's in the retrospection facilitator. So when the sprint starts, actually, they become the research assistant that makes sure that the Scrum team has a controlled experiment. So whatever we agreed to, they enforce. And if there's a problem with enforcement that some people are not adhering to what they agreed to, the Scrum Master's role is to bring the team together to say, we have an experiment, we are trying to control it, it's not being controlled, we need to fix it, and what should we do now? So in these experiments, it's important to seek what I call 50% invalidation rate. So some of our experiments should succeed, some should fail, and the reason is if some succeed and some fail, then it's very likely that we are not in this realm of not learning much. So if everything gets invalidated all the time, like our velocity is always lower than we expect, or if we're always succeeding, like our velocity is always higher than we expect, we're not really necessarily learning anything. We want about a 50% invalidation rate on our hypothesis. And Reinertsen is a guy that talks about this quite a bit. So the result of adaptively experimenting is that you get hyper-productive teams. It turns out that teams that have a really good retrospective produce about 40% higher quality code and about 100% faster production rate. And this is a study in a CMMI company that Karsten Jacobsen was the lead project manager for and wrote about it in 2009. So in other words, organizations that want to go faster, want to be more agile, disrupt themselves. They actually run experiments to try to figure out what the economy is like. So are we agile if we measure economic progress and we adaptively experiment to improve? Maybe not, because we might not be able to create fast enough to actually adapt to the chaos. We're able to sense and we're able to adapt, but we're not necessarily producing fast enough to win. So let's talk a little bit about the third pattern. So the problem that one major problem that we often face is that high utilization creates delay. So congestion creates delay, meaning that there's a lot of requests being made to a constrained resource. Cognition creates delay because we only have a limited ability to understand things, and you'll see some examples here. There's some other utilization issues that also create delay, and we don't talk about those here, but they're talked about in written form on the patterns. So you guys have seen this, a congestion pattern that happens in many freeways. This, I think, is in Thailand, And often I ask people, well, which side of the freeway do you think is going faster? And people take a while to try to figure this out, but in the end, they do. And that is the thing, the lane on the left is a faster lane than the lane on the roadway on the right. So the reason for that is we see all the space between cars, and that intuitively means that the road is going faster. Well, that's because it's less utilized. So the one on the left is less utilized, and therefore the latency, the delay from the time that a car stops until it gets to go again, is going to be faster. So it'll be down here. Whereas the road on the right is going to be more up here, much more congested, much more latency. So cognition also has a sense of work in process. So if you've got stuff you're thinking about and you're thinking about too many things, you have too much cognitive work in process. So George Miller did a study back in the 50s regarding how many concepts we could actually consider at one time and continue to get them right. And that is about 7 plus or minus 2 concepts are in your mind if you want to keep them in order. Early day decisions, we have a lot of glucose and we haven't made a lot of decisions, so we're not exhausted. Those decisions turn out to be better decisions, and we have some proof of that from the way judges behave and some other stuff. Sleep improves our ability to make decisions. Few interruptions help us make better decisions. Cognition is important. Therefore, limit work in process, and don't just limit actual physical work in process, but also cognitive work. So this is a graph about 7 plus or minus 2, and basically is saying that these are how many concepts we can remember simultaneously, and we get to about 5, and we continue to get on average about 100% result. But as time goes on, or as the number of concepts we're considering increases, after that we start getting error rates. So at about 7, our error rate is about 70%, and then it just gets worse from there. And with 10 concepts, there's no way that you can remember 10 concepts in order. You just fail. So we should be conscious of that, and that actually tells us something about how big backlogs should be. So how big should a sprint backlog be based on this graph? Well, you could do a 7-item backlog, and about 70% of the people in your team will remember the rough order of those things in the backlog. If you only have 5, though, everybody's going to remember, and everybody's going to be focused on the things they have to produce. So limiting work in process also means that we start thinking about incremental production. What I mean by that is, let's say we're building a car. We could build the perfect tires, and then we could build 2 perfect tires and a chassis. But at this stage, we haven't produced anything of direct value to a consumer. We haven't produced anything of direct value to a consumer, etc. Finally, when we get a roof over this thing, it's actually something that the consumer might be happy about. So here, the consumer wants transportation, right? And so a skateboard provides some transportation, not very much, but at least we can get the production all the way through the line, and we can deliver it to the consumer, and we can test lots of things along the way. We can test, can we ship these things to consumers? Do they like the fact that they can go about twice as fast on a sidewalk or not? And it turns out, well, they're not angry because they can do something a little bit better, but it's not as good as they wish. So now with a little handle on it, we get a little bit neutral. Here, we're starting to be able to go fast. It's a little bit better. Now with a motorcycle, we can really get to the office in time. And with a car, we can keep ourselves from getting wet. So the result of this idea of limiting work in process is that we can rapidly deliver small increments of value, and we can get rapid feedback from the customer about something we actually created. So that means that we can actually cancel work early if we're satisfying the customer, or we can cancel work early if we discover there really isn't a market for a feature that we thought would be a big seller. We can discover that early, and our sunk cost is low. We don't have the work in process is sunk cost. So once we deliver it, the cost is no longer sunk. We're earning money from it if the money is available, and then we can cancel it. We learn faster as the economy changes, and so the more we limit work in process, the faster we will adapt our creation process to the chaotic economy. With these three patterns, we are agile. We can sense, adapt, and create fast enough to meet the needs of the chaotic economy, and that's a very nice result. So it turns out that most agile methodologies and most lean Kanban methodologies have these principles at the head of their work. So you can put meetings, you can put decisions, you can put artifacts into one of these three buckets, and they all contribute to agility in this way. The thing is, though, that it'll be hard to keep this agility in this company if that's all we're doing, because there's reasons why some people don't want to measure economic progress. So, for example, you might be working on something really fun and it's really fulfilling and you're gaining mastery over a particular thing. But if we're tying it to economic progress, that means that my interests might not be aligned with the company's interests, and I might push back on that. In addition, measurements are always scary for managers because they may reveal the truth about a history of not necessarily achieving a lot of great outcomes. And so that doesn't, there are many reasons why outcomes are not great. It doesn't necessarily have to be because a manager is bad. But now we have to start explaining things, and some people might not be comfortable with failure or explanations like that and not willing to tolerate that. So that's a little bit scary for people who want a long-term career. Adaptively experimenting to improve also creates some failure, and if we are not good risk analyzers and risk mitigators, we can have situations where our experiments fail in a costly way. And so that those costly outcomes, if we're not good at it, will kind of limit our career within the organization as well. And finally, limiting work in process has a cost to it. So when we shorten the time frame that we deliver something, we actually are probably repeatedly doing things like regression testing, for example, has to be repeated every time you ship something. And localization is another thing that often has to be repeated with software. Anything that you do to package the product has to be repeated, and the repeating that has a cost. You can automate it, but that automation has to be done, and someone has to deliver that. So there's plenty of reasons why these three things are hard to maintain. So let's talk about two more patterns in agile practices. People create delay by avoiding responsibility. What I mean by that is until someone actually takes action, nothing gets fixed. So there's Christopher Avery's done some studies on this and how we psychologically go through the process of dealing with a failure or a problem. And we first deny that there's a problem. Then we look around to others to blame. We blame other people for the problem. We justify the problem by saying, gosh, it's the system that's at fault here. And then we might feel ashamed because we feel that we caused the problem. So we go into this guilty situation where we feel shame, but we don't know what to do. And so we don't actually improve anything. No problems get solved while we're feeling ashamed. we might feel obligated to just go, punch the clock and pay for our children's education in private school, but there, no problems get solved there. The only thing that really solves those problems is when people take personal responsibility for an outcome. Well, in an Agile setting, that means that we take responsibility for the collective output of our team. When we have collective responsibility, that means that everyone on the team is personally responsible for the collective output of the team. We need to provide autonomy, understanding, and authority in the team for them to feel a sense of collective responsibility. So this is often a cultural issue within organizations. Having information radiators helps us portray that information, and then teaching this responsibility process can be helpful to people, because the number one goal of this process is, once you know it, you want to go through it faster, because the faster you go through it, the more rapidly the team takes responsibility for a problem, and the more rapidly that problem gets fixed. So in a sense, this modifies limit, work, and process pattern by goosing it a lot with individuals on a team feeling personally responsible for the collective output. There's some techniques for helping produce this collective responsibility, and Christopher Avery does talk about something called tit-for-tat trust building, which is a very useful approach. So the result of collective responsibility is that people start collaborating to solve problems. And they start teaching each other, and they start learning new things, because if one person is unavailable, they want to be able to take on problems that have that specialization that that person has. So the best way to do that is to learn more about something like testing, for example. So if you only have one tester and you have a product being built, other people knowing how to test means that it will be possible for the team to adapt to increased workload that comes over time as the product gets more and more functions. So that's really useful. Also, this collective responsibility creates greater elasticity, meaning that as the work demands shift, because different customers want different things over time, our team has more excess capability in different areas and can change their focus on particular problems. So in a sense, this is respect for people from Toyota. So how does this affect our agility? Well, it improves our likelihood of adapting to changing circumstances. So if we just measure economic progress, adaptively experiment, limit, work, and process, then what happens if the workload changes? Well, we could have been agile at one time, but then we fail because we don't have the specialization that we really need to address new types of work. But when we have collective responsibility, we all feel this personal responsibility towards the collective output, and then we all pitch in to do whatever we need to do to actually satisfy that economy. So we are agile. We're a little bit more agile, though. We're more sustainably agile. So that's what I think this pattern is about. So there are external factors that affect our agility. So we might be a team that depends on the people who make tires. So Toyota, for example, had a famous problem that they wanted to do just in time. They had manufacturers that produced the tires they needed, and those manufacturers were not just-in-time manufacturers. So Toyota would get a car order and then would go all the way through and then say, oh, I need tires to put on this chassis. And they would go to the tire manufacturer, and the tire manufacturer would say, when do you need it? And Toyota would say, we need it today. And the manufacturer would say, well, we're currently running a different type of tire in our manufacturing plant. You'll have to wait until we switch back to this tire that you want, and that won't be for another 60 days. So you'll have to wait for that. Well, that wasn't really acceptable for a just-in-time manufacturer, but it caused them lots of delays and handoff interference. There's also issues with dependencies that they produce poor quality sometimes, and we have to deal with that. So that is a bummer. So in order to deal with these problems, you have to think systemically, and there's a lot of work in this area related to collaboration between teams and sort of cultures. So the way I think about this pattern is this is a shift. If you're a Scrum Master, you can take responsibility for the first 4 patterns. You can measure economic progress, you can adaptively experiment, you can limit work in process, you can promote collective responsibility within your team. But what happens here is now we're dealing with outsiders that we don't control, so it's not quite as easy. So now we have to coach people, or we have to be diplomats. We have to convert bosses to be agile. We have to change structural systems. We have to start looking at a whole system to try to figure out how to solve these problems with our dependencies. So this means that leaders have to start building collaborative teams of peers, for example, that actually work to solve problems between the different teams. And we need to promote this idea that we're all in this organization together, and we need to ritualize and celebrate problem solving. So it becomes less of a blame game. We did have that before, and then we adopted collective responsibility. And so once we have that within a team, we can actually produce more results more rapidly. But in this case, we're actually in a little team, and we actually are starting to promote agility outside the team, with teams particularly that we depend on. So this requires diplomacy, this requires coaching skills. This is what I think of as the coaching pattern in a sense, because now we don't control these people, we're not their bosses. In fact, we might even be trying to convert our own boss to do Agile for their work, because it will make our lives better and we'll be able to contribute better to the outcome for the company. So there's a lot of skills taught here. One of the things that we always teach in Scrum, or at least my peers always teach in Scrum, is something called theory of constraints. It turns out that theory of constraints isn't even in the definition of Scrum. And so why do we teach that? Well, we teach that because we know that Scrum teams operate within a system, and then actually have the Scrum Master particularly has to go out and resolve impediments, which are often in other teams. So here's an example of a systemic problem. We have a bunch of teams, and we want to change something in this infrastructure team. It actually has to bubble through these dependencies all the way up to a client for this application before it reaches a consumer. So let's suppose these people are using straight Scrum, where they actually ship every, let's say, 2 weeks. So each team ships every 2 weeks, and each of these teams is a component team. So this infrastructure team makes a change, and those changes go up to these compression teams, which then goes to a media transport team, which then goes to an infrastructure team, to an identity team, etc., all the way up, and it finally gets delivered to a customer. Well, that actually is going to take 9 sprints at least, and if these interactions between these teams are not synchronized, it'll likely take about 13 and a half sprints actually, because you have a delay from one team to the consuming team that is a result of them not having a synchronized sprint. Let's look for candidates that could be merged to shrink the height of this tree. So when we shrink the height of this tree, we'll actually deliver things faster to a consumer. So if we shrink it here, it turns out it'll shrink the time to a consumer in almost every case. If we shrink it down here, it doesn't shrink the time to consumers if there's a change up here, for example. So anyway, these are candidates that looked suitable for us in this organization to merge. And it turns out we didn't pick any of these. We picked this one. If we look carefully at this, this is one team that depends only on this team down here on the next level. So if we were able to combine these two teams, we would actually shift this system up so there's only 8 levels in our shipping. And that is exactly what we did. But the way we did it was we showed it to people in the company, and particularly architects and leaders, and they realized immediately how they could fix it. So they started lobbying their friends in these two teams to merge together, and it turned out to be easy to do that. And despite the easiness of it, it still took about 6 weeks to actually make that happen. So the result of solving systemic problems is that we end up having to promote a culture of problem solving. We start collaborating between teams of departments. We get a faster organization. We create greater awareness of other fields in the company that helps us produce better results. And we create greater elasticity because of that learning. Other people are able to fill in where necessary when we get into a crunch situation. So this is the 5th pattern, and the question is, are we agile? And I think the answer is yes, of course, since the first 3 get us agility. The 4th one gets us resiliency in agile, and the 5th one gets us an expansive agility. So now teams are highly motivated and have the patterns and skills that allow them to go outside the team and start helping other teams or people in the organization become agile. So now we come to the crux of the issue, the thing that got me to start thinking about agile-based patterns. I was very interested in organizations that seem to easily lose agility. And let me explain what I mean by that. Organizations would invest millions of dollars in hiring many coaches to help them become more agile. And then those coaches would come in, or trainers, and they would train hundreds of developers, maybe thousands of developers, and then they would leave the organization, and the organization would get slower and slower and slower after the coaches left. Well, one of those factors, of course, could be that these coaches are personally motivated to get people to be agile, and it's their lifeblood, so they're very interested in helping organizations get to that point. But you would think that once organizations realize the value of agility through their own work, that they would preserve that agility over time. And in fact, they don't seem to do that most of the time. So it turns out that agile-based patterns can help us diagnose what is happening in an organization. And in virtually every organization that has lost agility, I think that we find that something happens in the right-hand column that we see here. So let's just look at the agile-based patterns. We know we're agile if we measure progress. And what happens in organizations that lose agility is some of them stop worrying about metrics, about leading indicators that indicate whether they are succeeding. So in lean startup, this would be indicators like click-through rates and engagement and revenue per customer and that sort of thing. In Scrum, it's about velocity and bug count and happiness of the teams. If they stop worrying about these metrics, then they tend to lose organizational agility. And this is one of the concerns I have with some folks that are interested in no estimates. If they stop measuring anything, then we're in trouble. So they can compensate for that by measuring something, which is like, let's say, number of features produced or something like that. As long as they're measuring production, I think they're okay. But when they stop measuring anything, now we're in trouble. So experimentation also gets lost when we start discouraging teams from trying new things, or basically what happens with 80% of the teams is they phone in the retrospective. By that I mean that they basically do a meaningless retrospective. They don't actually look at previous metrics. They don't have a hypothesis. They don't, so therefore they don't actually validate or invalidate a hypothesis, and they learn nothing from the previous sprint. And so then when they set up a new sprint, they don't realize that they're setting up an experiment, so they don't have the Scrum Master control the experiment, and they don't try anything new that's actually going to help them because, well, some companies they don't do it just because no one demands that they do it. In some companies, they have experimented a lot and there's risk. So some of the risk is career risk. So when you do risky things, then sometimes you're going to fail. As long as you get some successes, most companies will think that you're okay. But it's weird, right? Like that some people have that experiment and actually are performing better. They might not see that performance over time. They might not be paying attention to that, but instead just notice that these people said they were going to get a velocity and they didn't get it, and then other times they said they would get a velocity and they got much higher. So this type of thing, experimentation does get discouraged, especially if a team is not displaying its experiments and what it's learning over time to defend itself against people who are saying, oh, well, you fail half the time. Companies that lose agility often take on too many projects. So they'll have more projects to make sure that all the product managers are happy because every one of the projects that the product managers thought of was actually funded somehow or staffed by a team. What we want to do is we want to pile most of our teams on the most profitable projects that we have until we saturate that project, until either we run out of teams or until adding another team would just make it slower. So then we have remaining teams that we can apply to lower profitability projects, and we keep doing that until we run out of teams. Well, if you do it that way, almost every company I know has way more projects than can be accommodated by the teams that they have available, and so some product owners are gonna not get their product staffed. So what we need to do in order to encourage companies to limit work in process is have a culture where everybody is aware of this pattern and how important it is, and have a sense of collective responsibility in product managers where they say, well, it's okay that my product wasn't funded this quarter. I'm going to help out with this other product, or I'm going to investigate some other new product ideas that I thought would be interesting. We also have to preserve the careers of innovative people who are doing this work. It's very difficult to do this in larger companies. Collective responsibility gets lost when we start assigning responsibilities. So some desperate CEOs and CTOs and other CXOs want to find some wringable neck. So I used to say that the product owner was the single wringable neck for a team. And actually, I don't think that's true anymore. I think it's really important for the team to feel collectively responsible that they have a good product owner. And if they don't have a good product owner, they need to work together with the product owner to help the product owner be better. When we assign responsibility, though, when we say so-and-so is a product owner, so-and-so is a tester, so-and-so is a developer, that responsibility causes us to lose elasticity. And losing elasticity means that when the workload changes, we lose our agility. So finally, Agile-based patterns have us solve systemic problems to have this expansive sense of agility. If we lose that, we can still have teams that are agile, but when they interact with each other, they create this non-agility. And it turns out this is a form of something called local optimization. Local optimization virtually always fails, particularly in complex systems like big teams and that sort of thing. What happens is each little team becomes very optimized, and then But the handoff between the teams is the thing that dominates the production cycle of the company. So I showed an example of that with that huge tree of dependencies. And it turns out if every one of those teams, was very agile, two-week sprints, they're actually able to ship every 2 weeks. It still took 18 weeks for the company to produce a product. So only when we start solving systemic problems do we start to address that. So I showed one example where people went in and through just one little tweak in the organizational structure, they were actually able to shave 3 weeks off an 18-week cycle, assuming all of these were 2-week sprints. And so that's a pretty good result. That's almost 20%. So systemic problem solving is something that is lost when we decrease visibility, when we sort of silo the organization, when we say such and so a manager is responsible for a particular segment and no one can mess with that territory. So territoriality really interferes with systemic problem solving. Also, cultures that don't learn, so cultures that don't encourage this idea of people learning new ideas and new ways of doing things, will tend to discourage systemic problem solving and the organization will lose agility. So I believe that these are the reasons that agility gets lost in larger organizations. And I want to talk a little bit about agile managers in this setting as well. So what do we see agile managers do? Well, we see them embracing these agile base patterns. So good agile managers actually measure leading indicators for success for their department or their team. And they don't use rolled up metrics from all the little teams to decide whether the team is successful. Instead, they use something big. They measure for example, the average lead time for a request that's made to the group, the organization, until the organization either rejects the request for now or satisfies the request. So many organizations have difficulty doing either one of those things. They just accept work that's handed to them and they don't reject it until it's very, very stale, and then they finally reject it. So that's a dysfunctional situation. That is a dysfunctional manager. He's not an agile manager anyway. So when they measure, they measure things like cycle time or lead time, and they measure quality, usually bug count, or in this case, when you're dealing with managers, you could be talking about a CTO or a chief marketing officer, and they might then measure something called the Net Promoter Score. How much do customers like the things that they're getting? They experiment and they create low-risk experiments for themselves. So, for example, an agile manager might be interested in improving recruiting in the company. One of the experiments that they could do is to try a new process for recruiting that's based on Kanban. So I would expect that a number of us have used Kanban for recruiting. It's awesome, actually. It starts addressing hiring needs much, much faster than you might otherwise expect. And then, but before they do that, they're going to run little experiments on one particular job opening to see if it works, and then try something else and see if it works. And once they get something that is working, they might start spreading those new processes. They're no longer experiments. They've been tried to other job openings. Limit departmental work in process. So I described something before where I said, well, we want to staff as much as possible the most profitable things that are coming to our department. Sometimes that requires collaboration with people who really make budgeting decisions, or who are product managers who have great ideas. We have to start educating them, and these types of agile managers will start educating them. Agile managers actually embrace responsibility. They accept responsibility for problems in the organization. So when something is late, they do embrace this responsibility. And one thing that they might do to deal with lateness in their teams is to start promoting this idea of looking at probability distributions for the rate at which things come out. They can do that using Monte Carlo simulation, which is now available in a bunch of tools. They can decide to help peers fix problems that are affecting them, or even just that are affecting the overall company, but not them. And then finally, Agile managers tend to increase visibility, collaboration, and problem solving across teams. And so that is a very different style of manager than we might see in a traditional organization that tries to assign responsibility to individual people under them. Instead, what we would do is we would start getting teams that got together to do root cause analysis, to do the kinds of static dependency mapping I showed, to do all sorts of things. So I've concluded through this discussion something that's maybe pretty challenging. Top-down Agile beats bottom-up. So some people misunderstand me when I say that. They think that I mean that top-down Agile is when a CEO or a CTO says, hey, all of our buddies are Agile, or all our competitors are Agile, and we're not Agile. It's the thing to do, and we need to be that. And so you guys in the engineering department need to be Agile. I will pay whatever is necessary to train all of you guys, because I know Agile is all about engineering. Well, that is a bottom-up strategy, even though it is ordered by someone at the top. What I mean by top-down Agile is where we start thinking about our own workload as executives, and we start listing what kinds of work we have to do that is what I think of as strategic work, work that is going to benefit the company long-term, rather than tactical or operational work that is just fighting fires that are happening around us that someone is urgently needing a fix for. So typically, if we favor things that are tactical or operational, we ignore strategic issues and we never systemically improve. Having no time to do strategic work, I've seen this in many executive staffs. And what that leads to is stagnation, no innovation. So top-down Agile managers would actually get teams of their peers together and either run Kanban or Scrum to address important strategic issues. If you can get your executives to be Agile themselves, what happens is that this propagates through the organization beneath them and starts making other people that work for them be Agile, because they need to address the concerns of the executive, and the only way to do that is to be Agile themselves. So it's funny, right? Like, I've given you this talk about Agile leadership patterns, and then I spent most of my time talking about Agile base patterns. And that's because it turns out that these base patterns are essential to understanding how Agile organizations and Agile managers operate. So if you want to be an Agile leader, you embrace these concepts for yourself, not just your peers. You do embrace them for your peers by teaching them to your peers or your reports, but they apply to you too. So each of us as individuals can be Agile. We can measure our own economic progress. If we're trying to lose weight, we can measure our weight. We can measure the number of times we exercise this week. We can measure a lot of things. We can proactively experiment different foods that we want to eat, different types of workouts. We can limit work in progress by actually not doing too much or not focusing on too many different types of things to address our weight issue. We can embrace collective responsibility by saying, Yes, I am personally responsible for my weight as well as the weight of people in my family. And then we can solve systemic problems. We can start thinking about, well, what are the schedules of people in the family and why is it that we always eat fast food in the family? Maybe we need to restructure how we get together, how we have meals, how we deal with life in general. So these agile-based patterns are broadly applicable. They're completely scalable and they apply in every case, I believe, for agile. So I hope this has been helpful to you, and if you want more information, you can click on this link. My organization, Senex Rex, is very focused on sustained agility in large companies, and we do services for those companies in the form of consultation, coaching, training. I hope you'll find us on the web, and I hope you'll find use from the work that we've published already. Thank you very much.